Hello, welcome everyone to the Carpenter Museum's very last lecture series for the 2020 season. I hope you are all well. I'm sure we'll have lots of other people streaming in the next couple of minutes as we get started, but it is 2 o'clock, so let's get underway. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. This is a very well-attended lecture, so everyone will remain muted for the entirety, just to make sure there's not any overtalk or confusion with lots of microphones on, so expect to remain muted. We are recording, so those of you with your video on, just know that this is recorded and it will eventually go up on the website. During screen sharing, the thing that is recorded is the screen, but during our question and answer part, your little bubble might show up. We are having a question and answer section at the very end. So if you have questions, hold them, they will be answered. The way that we are going to do the question and answers, because there are so many people who are attending, is we're going to do questions submitted in the chat box. You can see the chat box at the very bottom of your screen. It's a little one right in the middle that says chat. You type that in, and then I will moderate and read your questions aloud to Erin. If you are watching this on a device that does not have that chat box option, you can email me at the email provided in your Zoom link email, and I will check those as well to see if other people have sent in questions. All right. Without further ado, I will introduce Erin. Erin Flynn is a project archaeologist at the Public Archaeology Laboratory in Pawtucket. She has worked at archaeological sites in southeastern New England for over 19 years. Ms. Flynn's area of study is New England area Native American life from 8,000 to 3,000 years ago. And Erin, I'll let you have the floor.
Thank you so much. I hope everyone can hear me well. It's great to be here. I'm always excited to talk about archaeology, and to see so many people so interested is always great. So I'll hopefully try to keep this focused, and I do have an 8-year-old downstairs, so we'll see how that goes. But I really wanted to start with one of kind of the main questions I get often is, you know, where do you get to dig? Why do you get to dig? And so I just wanted to quickly talk about that the majority of archaeologists like myself work in cultural resource management. So just quickly, cultural resources include archaeological sites, but they include a lot of other things too. So roads and trails, historic buildings, bridges and dams, and Native American sacred places. And about 90% of archaeologists in the United States work in cultural resources, so not at a university. And within cultural resource management, we often work under permit and for projects that are have a triggering agency such as federal funds or overall permitting, so with the state, so NEPA or environmental protection. So if someone's looking for salamanders before development, they might also need a cultural resource survey. So where do we get our site information? So I do want to touch upon that there are different ways that we look for sites, or that we know of sites, and those include academic programs and field schools, accidental discovery, and that means maybe a house is being built in a new place and a small family plot, a cemetery is discovered, or sometimes even people in their garden find artifacts. Tribal members often have ancestral knowledge of places. Avocational archaeologists, specifically in southern New England, have an unbelievable role in finding and identifying sites. And a lot of our archaeological sites have been discovered this way, or listed this way. And like I said, artifact collectors and local homeowners often have had artifacts and turned them in or talked about them. We put a dot on the map. And then local histories, maps, photos are all other ways that we find sites. And lastly, cultural resource management studies, so surveys like I have been conducting for the past 20 years. So overall, for Rehoboth, when I want to talk about what we know, There's a ton of history. I think you just drive through Rehoboth and you can see all of that. And there's, of course, the antiquarians. It's a lot of people are interested, which is great. But I just wanted to point out that local collectors, so specifically Martin Hall, so the 1930s, a local collector, actually a couple of others from the Massachusetts Archaeological Society, local collectors would see farm fields and pick up artifacts, know certain spots. And then town histories, there's cemeteries and mills, historic homes, and meeting houses. And I just put Otis Dyer here because he did a lot of work to identify these sites and help the town make a booklet for this. And then the CRM surveys, there was about 16 recorded for the town. So these projects are across all sections of town. And like I had said before, these are conducted prior to or as part of development. And at least 11 of them are just for utilities. And I noticed my name is on, I think, at least 4. So I've done a decent amount of the work that's for recorded archaeological surveys in town, for sure. And one of those projects included a merit badge project for Boy Scouts of America, which I was lucky enough to do and take part of. So archaeological sites in Rehoboth are listed with the Massachusetts Historical Commission, and 27 ancient Native American sites are listed as of right now. And those range from Paleo-Indian, so like 12,000 years ago, up until contact period. And those sites range from large village sites to small isolated artifact finds. So we have the complete range of Native life. And then there's only 4 historic archaeological sites listed. Those include Native American and Euro-American sites, and those also have this wide range, 17th to the 20th century. And there's only 4, so I was able to list them here very quickly, but the Shad Factory, Anawan Rock, Peck Street Cellar Hole, and Palmer River Meeting House. So all 4 of these archaeological sites, pretty well known. I think 3 of them actually have signage. And the Peck Street Cellar Hole, I'll talk a little bit about it as we go through. So first of all, as we kind of start our conversation, I really wanted to talk about how when we look at Rehoboth, we're talking about the Wampanoag homelands. And the map shown here is a trail map and native names. And this is from Our Beloved Kin by Lisa Brooks. It's a Native perspective on King Philip's War. This is from her website. I tried something new. There's on the top right hand is a kind of white square, and that you can use your smartphone camera and just point it at that and it'll take you right to her website. It's an unbelievable educational source that maps and tools as you read this perspective, and it really gives you an understanding of like how many places these names, people have been here a really long time and are still here today. And I work with Native people almost every day. So I just always want to remind people of that. So the Rehoboth's ancient Native American history, really when we see this, these little squares take up a big space, right? So Rehoboth is a long rectangular. We can see that they're kind of focused along the lower Palmer River. The orange blobs that you also see, those are actually the projects themselves. So you get a sense that there's not been many large-scale projects in Rehoboth that require cultural resource management survey or a professional survey. But there's definitely a lot of sites and they are focused along the Palmer River. And really across the town. So we have an understanding that these are really focused or tied to their environment, a freshwater source, access to plants and animals, marine sources, and they're along trails and water routes. So the Palmer River being a route that Native people definitely sought after and used for their resources. There's also things that we might not see now. So maybe a wetland source was great for reeds and matting or medicine. That's all taken into account. So like I've mentioned before, pre-contact or ancient Native American sites, these range in all different types of a combination of materials. So they can be an isolated stone tool or a spear point. It can be what we consider an activity area. So maybe someone was sitting and making a stone tool and just left chips behind. They can also be temporary campsites, seasonal villages, burial grounds, shell middens, and trails. So often it's asked, how do we know what we know? And I'd like to point out that the kind of meticulous methodology, our slow, concentrated digging allows us to see patterns over time, and site types and artifacts change over time. And along with specialized analysis, so late 40s, we started using radiocarbon dates on features, or what we consider like fire cracked rock hearths and heat elements, to also get dates that we can put with these artifacts. And so as we go through time, we're able to make a better timeline and see how these sites have changed. Specialized analysis not only is radiocarbon dating, which I won't get into the specifics, but we also do flotation. So that's where we actually look for charred seeds and small flakes out of the soil. There is soil chemical analysis, XRS or X-ray fluorescence, which might look for certain metals in the soils. And more we're seeing that these tests can be used in the field, and they're not too expensive, and it's allowing us to collect even more data to compile to make our narrative. So how do we know the age of a site? Like I said, because we've been able to acquire radiocarbon dates and we associate them with certain styles or shapes of arrowheads or projectiles or spear points, over time we've been able to compile enough information to really see distinct changes in site types and attribute them to a certain shape of the spear point. So I've just put out that we often talk in Paleo-Indian is 12,000 to 10,000 years ago. The Archaic is 10,000 to 3,000. Woodland is 3,000 to essentially contact period. And within these groups, there's more detail. And I also wanted to point out the New England Typology by Jeff Boudreau is an excellent resource if you're interested in looking at beautiful examples of projectile points or spears from New England along with that time, the time period. It's a beautiful book that the Massachusetts Archaeological Society sells. It's a great resource. And just pointing out, like the picture here is of crew members of mine that were, by digging slowly and meticulously, they found this beautiful hearth that had a late archaic point directly associated with it. And it gives us so much information. So when we talk about early Native American sites, it's usually based on the stones that we find, our stone spear points, the chips that are left behind, even preforms or scrapers. We have all sorts of different names, but when we put all these things together, we see certain trends. So the type of spear points might be of a certain material that was preferred at a certain time. The sites themselves, we can have these great illustrations. Dana Riccardi, who works at PAL, is an archaeologist and now makes our maps. She's a local artist, and she did this great illustration kind of showing the potential of a site that we find. And so putting these pieces of rocks that might just anyone else might walk right over, we look and it turns into this narrative of what people were trying to do, what they were making, and how they were living. And also there's other elements. So for food processing, I always like to bring up an ulu or a semi-lunar knife, the mortar and pestle. These are things that people still have in their kitchen, right? There's something that's still being used. And I love that, that they were such great tools. We continue to see them. So other aspects that we find at sites that come together to make this narrative include burned bone, scrapers that might have been scraping hides, drills, stone drills that could be punctuating leather or hide for clothing, And pottery is something that we also find. So I have this beautiful picture of a full pot with a beautiful rim. But to be honest, we typically find the little crumbs that you see next to it. So they're so small. And it's all also related to that, our soils being so acidic in New England. So we often only find these stone tools. So another big aspect, and this is actually a big part of my study and focus, is looking at what we call features. So these are soil stains that we find in the ground. So these can often be like a shell midden you see in the top left. So stratified, someone threw their trash in there. The shell actually neutralizes the acidity in the soil, so we can find sometimes bone tools or more organics. And then we have on your right-hand side a fire-cracked rock heart, so almost what you'd build now if you went camping. We find that in the soil. And then in the bottom left, I always like this picture as a good illustration where we have large native pits next to plow scars. So the long linear stripes that you see is from a plow that just cut right across the top of these buried trash pits or native features. And then the last one is one that is a big part of my focus, is these really hard to see features. So if you can see at the top of that soil column, it's almost hard to, it doesn't look any different than the surrounding soil. So unlike the others on this slide, where you really notice a difference, it pops, it's a dark color, it's a concentration of stone. That last one, it's really hard to see until you get very deep into the soil. And the subtlety in the texture and change is so important. And I find that the more I excavate, the more pits I find. And a lot of them are these almost empty looking or very subtle features, and they're large. And to me, it's really important because it tells us that people were staying long enough to dig these big pits, right? That they were investing in that spot for some reason. So that's important to us as archaeologists. So as we kind of start to look at our timeline and discuss the sites in Rehoboth, I just wanted to bring up to another part of our journey with archaeology is when we look at a place, we have to include, we're talking about 10,000 years ago in a place. So we have to include sea level rise. And the shoreline as of now is really probably about 6,000 years old, maybe 5,000, which means that if people were preferring to live by the ocean, those sites are now underwater. So if we have certain ideas of where sites might be, and those sites may be completely encapsulated and covered like a perfect time capsule, but they've also been threatened by coastal erosion and large storms. And so looking for these sites has become a big part of archaeology now, where the potential for preserved organics underwater would be amazing. The potential to find more of these sites is a great thing. So when we do look at Paleo-Indian sites, there's at least 2 in Rehoboth listed, which really surprised me and I thought was really awesome. I included actually a drawing that was with one of the site forms. It's over on your right hand of the screen. It's actually a restored sketch. Dr. Fowler did a lot of sketches for the Massachusetts Archaeological Society and I believe the Narragansett Archaeological Society before it stopped. But the idea that we see these early points, they're usually isolated points along the Palmer River in Rehoboth, incredibly cool, and shows a really long history of use of native use of the lands in Rehoboth. These sites, by excavations and the little that we found, typically these sites are more nomadic groups of families that looked for or followed large mammals, The points are often these more rare materials that come from across the US, like, or Maine and Pennsylvania. They often have a nice fluted area or a flake channel on the bottom there, and it often can speak to how it was put onto a shaft. So we have a lot of some information, but I actually often wonder if there's more of these triangles and broken points in collections that we just didn't get to identify, because it is a triangle. They could be broken, and if it is more of isolated finds, maybe they're still out there. So I hope that we continue to add to the story of the Paleo-Indian period. So as we continue, the Archaic period, I mean, this is a 5,000-year span. I'm definitely simplifying these time periods to fit, but I really wanted to use these illustrations that kind of show how people really were using the artifacts that we find. So on the left-hand side, you can see a native person with what's called an atlatl. So there's a weighted stone, a long spear, and a spear point. And this has been found in caves. So we've actually found a spear with a hafted point, the rod or thrower with the weight, not in New England, but we know of this type of technology. And then when we look at the spears and potential weights, we see a similarity in the use. So we don't have the wood, but we can say that this is what we believe people hunted before bow and arrow, which came much later. A lot of times too, when we look at spear points or arrows, these often could be knives or hafted to small handles. They're not the typical bow and arrow as people think, but a multi-use tool even. So something to keep in mind. And I really wanted to bring up too the importance of canoes, woodworking tools during the Archaic period. We see an increase of these tools, suggesting that people making canoes and using them was an important way of life. So we see that in their toolkit. We see more of these tools. I just wanted to kind of include a close-up of what is kind of illustrated here. And this is another Fowler illustration from a bulletin that is actually on their website that people have access to. And I mean, canoes are important now to Native people, and they continue to make them. And in Rehoboth, I really wanted to talk about the Toby site. This is a really unbelievable site that was excavated by the Kohanut chapter of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society. I found this in my research for my own master's thesis, where I was looking actually for pit houses. So I believe that I found a pit house in Kingston, Massachusetts, and the more archaeologists I talked to, the more people seem to have thought that they found them too. So these are huge pits that were excavated down into the ground. I included a map that I made for my thesis, which included all these sites in southern New England that we believe that we have these large pits. And the Toby site in particular, it was considered to be a sweat lodge, but I do think it's important to bring up that the architectural type, maybe the use is different, but the architectural type is this large semi-subterranean pit that probably had maybe just a simple wetu or covering on the top. There's an excellent write-up of this by Ted Ballard, who helped excavate the site that's on the Massachusetts Archaeological Society website, and really talks about the environment of the Palmer River where the Toby site is. And I just really, stuff like this is a site that would have been just destroyed possibly, or not even acknowledged if it wasn't for this chapter and for the efforts of Brady Fitz and Ted Ballard and Don Doucette. And they were so helpful in giving me information and sharing information. So I really had to call out how important that is for understanding Native life in southern New England. So all of these things come together, the stone tools and the changing of site types over time, and the toolkits are used by archaeologists to come up with, we see a seasonal camp lifeway. And this is an illustration from the Rehoboth Museum's, Charles T. Robinson's Native New England, The Long Journey. This is a book, this is how I found the Toby site before it had a published reference. And I thought it was a good illustration to share, and a shout out to a Rehoboth for having these great illustrative ways of learning about Native life. So I wanted to include this too. This is some examples of transitional archaic period. I believe the Fuller Brook site has some elements of this, but I'm simplifying general changes in how people were living. And in the archaic period, it wasn't like, oh, it's Tuesday, we're done living a certain way and we'll just start making a different type of arrowhead and doing something different. All of these things transition and change over time, and it can be pretty slowly. And the transitional archaic, just kind of some of the main points is we do see stone bowls being used. So these slides are primarily from Rhode Island, where they have some unbelievable soapstone or steatite sites where you can actually see where these bowls are being quarried out and used. But the transitional archaic period also, we see differences in stone tools and potential kind of cultural changes, as well as cemeteries. So during that time, we start to see clusters of burials, which is interesting, and a transition into that woodland life. So I think most people, when they think of Native American sites or if they think of Plymouth Plantation, this is an illustration from the Peabody Museum in Andover. And the woodland period, we see a transition from those stone bowls into pottery and maybe larger gatherings or villages. And I mean, this illustration I liked because you could almost imagine that's the Palmer River in the background. There's a possibility of these large sites utilizing the river. And I thought it was important to kind of bring up how all these pieces come together to produce this. So in the upper right-hand corner, you can see the kind of the dark spots in the light soil. And archaeologically, this might be what I'm seeing. I see several pits and I see post molds, and they might just look like soil stains. But what does the narrative, how does that come together? And it might look something like the illustration you see. So once again, just overall, the artifacts that we find and that have been reported for Rehoboth all come together to suggest all these different elements. So there's stone tool making and nut harvesting, there's food storage, ceremony and burial, and hunting. And these are all things that we look for in these sites. And we've seen in several of the sites reported. So there's at least 2 sites that have a range. So they were used for like 10,000 years. And that's amazing. We don't have too much information. The Toby site seems to be one of 2 sites that have been, professionally excavated that were able to get a better narrative of what happened there. But I always like to kind of put these illustrations that really put in mind, like finding a little stone arrowhead. What does that mean? What were people doing and why were they there? So as we transition to the historic site, so contact period, we know that there's unbelievable history in Rehoboth. But like I had said, there's only 4 listed archaeological sites for that historic time, but we know that there's plenty more. So I wanted to just point out how do we identify these historic sites? And they include Native American and Euro-American. And those are from historic maps, town histories, diaries and journals, deeds and plan maps. And the one below, I really wanted to include. So when I was doing research for Camp Buxton and the Boy Scout Merit Badge Project, I like to look for deeds and see what information I can get on who lived there and actually land use. And when I found this map, I couldn't believe it. It was so great because it has so many details. Often plan maps that with deeds have like 4 corners and that's it. So I got on this and I'm like, sandy clearing and pine trees and stone walls, and the level of detail is amazing. It's an unbelievable resource to be able to look at, and you can sometimes follow an old cart path to a cellar hole, or you can follow a cart path to maybe a well. And when I put environmental features on there, I really kind of wanted to point out that as an archaeologist, when I look at a landscape, I might be in the middle of the woods, but I have definitely found a old cellar hole or site from ornamental plants. You could be in the middle of nowhere and then you see daffodils poke up, or just recently I read a great study about lilac bushes being put next to your privy or your restroom, so before they were in your house, and you'd want that smelly flower, that lovely flower next to it. So archaeologists are noticing that there is this connection with these ornamentals and finding something like a privy, which on a historic site, the restroom might contain some of the most information you can get on the way of life of the people that were there, because people would throw trash in there. So for the actual historic archaeological sites in town, archaeological sites, they can be houses and outbuildings, industrial mills, factories, community structures, so meeting houses, roads, shipwrecks, and burial grounds are all types of post-contact or historic archaeological sites. And I just, I wanted to include Anawan Rock, obviously incredible, well-known site for the area and a big part of the town's history. I thought it was interesting that, I'm focusing on archaeology, and what I noticed was, I don't know if there's actually been archaeology conducted there. And for a town like Rehoboth, with only 4 archaeological sites that historic period, I think it's important to acknowledge, like, there's so many sites that are probably there. We might not have dug them, but we know that they exist, right? We know the history's there. Now the Peck Street well and cellar hole, that one was one of mine. So I included a picture. You can see the bottom left, that's a well. So as I was walking around the project area, I almost fell in. It was super scary, as you can imagine. These features they're out there, and it's something we often look for. The project, nothing was being disturbed, so I didn't actually get to dig around the cellar hole or the well or do much research because it wasn't being impacted. We were essentially doing a cell tower, and so we knew it was in the area, but they were going to stay far away from it, so it's still there, holding its secrets, you could say. And this site might have been used for a short amount of time. It might have a small number of artifacts, but very cool site, just a small cellar hole and well that we were able to find. So although we only had 4 archaeological sites to talk about, I just had to bring up how many historic sites are in Rehoboth. So the QR scan there, it would bring you right to this brochure or booklet that was the Rehoboth Historical Commission. They just updated, I guess, in 2016, and it looks like a lovely resource. It has 26 sites. I believe they all have placards, which I thought was really cool for educational benefit. But I really wanted to point out that when I do my research and I look with the Massachusetts Historical Commission, I actually found approximately 266 historic inventory points. So a lot of those are houses and they're still being lived in, which I thought was amazing. So it's a lot of history, and it's like people are still living there. people are still using these houses, or maybe a house was rebuilt over the old house. And then there's also 5 historic areas. So those areas might just be the where the Carpenter Museum is, where there's several areas we know that's important to the town. And I just wanted to point out one of them. So like this is the lower Palmer River area. So I talked about this earlier because you can see that there's a concentration of archaeological sites that were identified. They were mostly by an avocational collector, at least 41 individual properties. And this is about a 300-acre property. The Public Archaeology Lab, actually, one of my coworkers wrote up the area form. And this is meant to be a tool for the town for maybe planning. And it allows there to be a discussion about the potential significance of the area. So on the form, we see that there's all these areas, so architecturally, archaeologically, conservation, education, transportation, these are all major points of significance. And that word, significance, it's often attributed to how we deal with the federal laws or the National Register. So ways that we can protect and talk about or have a conversation about how we want to see these sites used, or what might happen to them over time. So a lot of this too, it comes down to gathering this information and overall the protection and preservation. So like that area that we saw, that could be used as a critical planning concern or something that is on everyone's radar in town. A big part of protection and preservation is just public awareness. I think the signage is amazing. Obviously the community with the Historical Society or Commission seems strong, which is great. But there are other, protection measures or preservation, open space acquisition and preservation restrictions. There's also partnerships with conservation groups, so like even by the state. But there's also local bylaws. So like I said, there's often surveys are conducted under federal laws or because of federal monies. But there are several towns in Massachusetts that have town bylaws. There's even a town, Medfield, Mass, that has an archaeological commission that looks at projects before they're being constructed and gives a chance just to have the conversation if they're important to the town or not. Some towns, even just having that ability to talk is important to them, to have the conversation. And we do see that there is some site protections on regional levels. So Archaeological Conservancy has bought some sites to protect them. And overall, it's about the conversation between archaeologists, like being able to share with you what I find and why I think it's so important is amazing. And it's important, but to have that interaction between Native Americans and descendant groups. So maybe a local family that's still there and really is, invested in the community. That's all an important part of this work. And so once again, why do we need to protect these sites? They aren't renewable. Archaeology is destruction, we often say. So the information is lost when the site is disturbed or even excavated by me. The hope is that as an archaeologist, we're able to excavate in a way that we can piece everything back together and we can share that information with the community and add to maybe an unwritten history. And site preservation, it can be coupled with other factors like land and environmental conservation. So archaeology doesn't stop construction or anything like that. But for towns like Rehoboth with such an unbelievable history, it's important to bring up that there are lots of different ways, very creative ways, that the state and towns are coming up with ways of like how they want to see sites dealt with and maybe preserved. And overall, it helps preserve the past for the future. So there's things that 20 years ago when I started in archaeology, I never thought was possible. So maybe having an XRF gun that I could take in the field with me and shoot and look for metals in soils, I never thought was a possibility. So there is that part of me that's always thinking about what will be next. Like, what is the possibility that I could find or interpret or help? So that's something that's always in the back of my mind. So thank you so much. I really appreciated the time. I know I put a lot of information into a short amount of time, but I could talk all day, I think, about these sites. So I really just, I wanted to include this picture because in the summer I was lucky enough to paddleboard and get to look at the river and see the Palmer River and just unbelievable resources there. So my mind was blown. It was lovely. And I included another QR for people to use their smartphone if they wanted to check out the PAL website or the Public Archaeology website, which does have more information and links if you need it. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
All right, thanks, Erin. That was fantastic. So now is the time for everyone to submit their questions in the chat box below. I will give everyone a few minutes just so they can start coming in, and I will check my email as well, and we'll get to answering your questions. All right, our first question is, when we hike, we see something called paper roads, stone walls on each side. What are these?
So they could be literally a farmer's road or cart path. So I also have seen them called paper roads, but they could have been an original alignment connecting two places. The Southern New England has a ton of stone, and we know that not only did Euro-American people make stone walls, we know that Native people made stone walls too. So we often see them across everywhere, but it usually can just be a sign of a farmstead and a place to take stone out of the soil for farming purposes. So you'd kind of put them to the side and make a stone wall. And then as time went on, kind of Victorian era, people made more and more stone walls to kind of gentrify, or so we start to see stone walls around cemeteries in the 1800s and things like that. But the stone line roads, they're very common in New England and often are a sign of just a simple farmstead, if not an old road for the town.
Okay. How much has the Palmer River location changed from thousands of years ago?
Ooh, good question. I don't know if I can, how far reaching, but we do see on basic topo maps that there's a wide swath with swampy areas to either side. Even as if you've been on the river lately, you probably see the potential for that snake to move back and forth over time. So we know that there was a point where it was drier and then wetter. Obviously, historic dams and things have, changed the water course, but there's always potential for the rivers to move quite a bit. It also depends on the basic geology, or so if it's on a bedrock rather than loose soil, that river might kind of stay its course over hard stone rather than in nice soils where it can gently drift. So I don't have like an exact number, but I do believe it's wavered over time, if that makes sense.
Is the Camp Buxton map available online somewhere?
I do believe that there are maps of the camp online. So there's like a historic one that I know that I was able to find, and the Bristol County deeds. That's where I got the Otis survey map from the 70s. So that's available online. You can look up your own property, or you can look up any property. That's how I got those. But we didn't actually do, I considered it a sensitivity map. So I looked at the area for potential for archaeological resources, but we didn't do a lot of digging. As you can imagine, for a merit badge, we had limited time and resources to kind of deal with a large scale survey of the property.
All right, this one's a bit of a long one. My son and grandson live on the Lower Palmer, just above the Warren Bridge. And, okay, hold on just a second. My son and grandson live on a Lower Palmer, just above the Warren Bridge, found an arrowhead in topsoil in a garden this summer. They were amazed, so I did a quick local Native American 101 SOAMs, being the last occupied area alongside first settlers. So I'm not sure if there's a question there or just a fun
That's amazing. That's definitely amazing. And there's a potential that could have been an area identified by a local collector before. So there's some larger village spots or concentrations of artifacts, but that's awesome. You can always try to like contact Massachusetts Archaeological Society, send a picture. We always love that kind of stuff to increase our knowledge of the area. You know, feel free to definitely share a point on the map. Private property law is very strong in the United States. No one's going to take your artifacts. We really just like to be able to talk about and see where Native people were traveling. So that's great.
Based on what you found, can you tell what kind of rituals were observed?
Oh, that's a tricky one. Burials often tell a lot about people's religious beliefs or spiritual beliefs. So we do see trends over time. So even historically, like I was saying, that stone walls became a thing. Before that, like in the Swansea Rehoboth area, a lot of the religious values, you kind of actually left historic cemeteries derelict because you kind of wanted to scare people into being better humans. So we definitely often see these kind of cultural changes with burial ceremonialism. So I did kind of talk about that, you know, transitional archaic, we start to see cemeteries. So people like 3,000 years ago were coming back to the same spot and interring a person. And we also see in the archaeological record for Native people, changes in how they were being buried. So maybe cremation was a thing, and we see changes on how the burial was interred. So if it was maybe burned or cremated in one place and then moved to another place. But Native Americans themselves hold a lot of their own history and ideas for this. So I do think that archaeologically we're able to see some of this and have a conversation with Native people about how it's changed over time. But it is a tricky thing to say, oh, this style of arrowhead was made by someone west of the Hudson River, and then they came into southern New England and they adopted the culture. These things are tricky, as you can imagine, the farther back in time we go, if that helps.
Is there any evidence of fun and games, that is lacrosse or some other sport, for example?
Oh, Definitely there have been gaming pieces identified in pre-contact or Native American sites. I keep assuming that this is kind of ancient Native American stuff that we're talking about, but there's definitely gaming pieces, decorated or petroglyphs like stone tools or stone objects. I personally, I don't know of direct evidence of lacrosse. I know that Hudson Valley and Iroquois, like the further kind of northwest we go, there might be more evidence of those types of games. And but Native people, you know, contact period, a lot of people, or Roger Williams has accounts of gaming. We found some gaming pieces, so we know that people were people, that they were playing and enjoying life and doing all the things that we kind of do now.
Okay, a question from Leela, who is 8 years old, is how deep usually are the sites that you dig?
Ooh, good one. So we often can dig up to like 3 feet, so maybe as tall as you. But a lot of sites in southern New England are probably only about a foot or so below the ground, but there's a lot of factors that come into that. So sometimes if a place sand is eroding, it might seem like it's right on the top. But a lot of sites in New England are buried deep underground, so at least a foot.
Okay. Emma, who is 10, asked, have you ever been able to dig under the Palmer River, like underwater?
No, I have not, but it'd be very interesting. Like someone had asked how much the river has moved. It'd be great to get a sense if there's any areas that have been capped or sites that have been preserved along those edges, because they could be really old and it could preserve a lot of organic material like mats and baskets and things that we really never find.
All right, and that concludes the questions that have been submitted. Erin has provided her email there, and as well as the QR code for further questioning. I'm sure she'd welcome any emails if someone thinks of something afterwards. But thank you again so much for coming and speaking at our lecture series. This was fantastic.
Thank you so much. It was great to be here.
All right, enjoy your Sundays, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.